Hello, everyone. My name is Mike Emery, and I am the site administrator of the Cornwall Iron Furnace, a historic site located in Lebanon County, Pennsylvania, and part of the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. And the presentation today that we're going to do is called Slavery and Cornwall Iron Furnace. With me today is our wonderful summer intern, Victoria Abramczuk. And she has done a vast amount of research on this topic. Most of our properties, we every once in a while need to go back and re-examine the history that was done about them, but also as new records become available, as people that want to really tell a more complete story at our historic sites. One of the things that Victoria was working on this summer was looking at various records throughout many of different repositories, including here. But of course, I don't want to steal her thunder and let her tell about her project. But I'm really looking forward to not only hearing this myself, but also for the members of the general public to know more about this really great history that we have here at Cornwall Iron Furnace. So with that, Victoria, we'd like to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Mike. I'm super pleased to meet you all and delve into the subject of slavery at Cornwall. So just want to send a big thanks to Michael Emery, who you just heard, for all his help during the project. And just as another quick introduction, I'm Victoria Abramczuk. I'm a summer intern here at Cornwall Iron Furnace, and I'm a rising sophomore at Bucknell University, currently going for a biology major. So talking about the project here, our goal was just to really delve into slavery as a whole and get a better idea of really the enslaved people who are working at Cornwall, how many maybe there were, what kind of roles they had, and what living conditions were like for them, who their owners were, and really what might have happened to some of these individuals after slavery started tapering off in Pennsylvania. So for this project, a bulk of what I did was looking at journals and ledgers from between 1756 and 1786 from both the Pennsylvania State Archives and the Lebanon Historical Society. So these documents are really just records of financial transactions. Some of them are pretty simple balances of people's accounts, but others are more detailed descriptions of what items people are buying. And so with these documents, you do sometimes see references to the enslaved people at Cornwall, and you can kind of glean off information from that and get an idea of who is at the furnace and some idea of what they're doing. So there is a bit of a focus on those early years at Cornwall, but I also did look at notes transcribed by a previous intern covering 1776 up to 1782, and those are from the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. I also looked at various runaway slave ads from the Furnace collection, the book Blacks Who Stole Themselves, and also newspapers like the Pennsylvania Gazette. All this information is supplemented by census reports from between 1800 and 1840, as well as some secondary sources, various academic articles and books, especially those talking about some of the slave owners. So with that said, we can get into the topic. Obviously, you don't generally think of Pennsylvania first when you think about slavery in the United States, but it certainly was present, even though it never reached quite at the heights that you see further down south. Even at its peak in 1750, enslaved workers only really made 5% of the PA population. And after that, the number started to decrease with about 800 enslaved workers in 1810 and no registered enslaved people by 1850. However, even though slavery in Pennsylvania might not be as prominent as in other states. That certainly doesn't discredit it in any way and make it any less important of a subject to talk about. And there are certainly hundreds of enslaved individuals who spent their lives working in Pennsylvania, and I think it's important to delve into that part of our history. So slavery is relevant to Cornwall Iron Furnace in a number of ways. Most notably, often the biggest slave owners in Pennsylvania, especially going into the 1800s, were iron masters. Iron plantations would have been one of those industries where you needed a fairly large labor force and on a very consistent basis. And so it was one of the industries that you would especially need enslaved people for in Pennsylvania. On a larger scale than the iron industry just ties into the transatlantic slave trade. And often iron bars would have been traded either directly for enslaved people coming from Africa or for products that would eventually be exchanged for those enslaved people. And so on both a smaller and larger scale, then Cornwall is very much tied into slavery. All right, so the first record we really see of an enslaved person at Cornwall is in 1752 with founder William James buying a jacket for cuff. However, it's quite possible that slavery existed at Cornwall before that time. And generally my belief is that slavery existed at Cornwall between the 1750s going into the early 1800s. And during that period, over 100 different individual enslaved people would have worked at Cornwall. At any given time, the number of enslaved people would have fluctuated, but at times it was quite a large percentage of the workforce, making up to 1/4 of the people working here at Cornwall. So one of the primary reasons furnaces like Cornwall would have needed to use enslaved labor was because they needed to fill the large workforce needed to operate the furnace. And especially during wars like the French and Indian War and Revolutionary War, disruptions in naval trade would have really lessened the flow of immigrants coming into the US and also created a bit of a labor shortage. So enslaved people were a way of getting consistent labor for not too bad of a cost. And though it is difficult to talk about, then enslaved workers were given a monetary value. This value could range between anywhere from 10 to 85 British pounds. You do see that number changing a bit over time with values going as high as 85 pounds in the 1760s, but by 1789, only really seeing highs in about 48-pound range. Unfortunately, the value of a slave did depend on their ability to do work. So, for example, Exeter, who was marked as lame in 1789, was only valued at 15 pounds, while Tom, age 4, in the same year, was only valued at 10 pounds. So along with this trend, then generally as enslaved people became older, you see their value going down. Along this note, then enslaved people were a mix of being company owned and listed in the inventory for the company itself, and owned by individuals and simply sent to work at the furnace. So sometimes if you simply look at the inventory, you don't quite get a complete idea of how many enslaved people were actually working at Cornwall. For example, in the 1764 journal, there are 6 individual slaves listed as property of the furnace. But in reality, there were about a dozen other enslaved people working at the time at Cornwall. And so at times it can be difficult compiling all the different ways slaves and enslaved people are accounted for in these records. So it's impossible to talk about the first few years at Cornwall without mentioning the Giles lease. So only 3 years after opening the furnace, Peter Grubb leased both Cornwall and the Hopewell Forge to 12 partners for a 20-year lease ending in 1765. However, by 1750, due to financial woes, that lease had transferred almost entirely to Jacob Giles and Amos Garrett, two Marylanders. Giles in particular would take a leading role in operating the furnace. He was a fairly prominent landowner living in Harford County, Maryland, and he had previous experience in the iron industry. Part of the reason he chose to lease Cornwall was because of its proximity to the Susquehanna River, which flows down into the Harford County area. So it was quite easy to trade iron between Cornwall and his other properties down at Harford.
Well, just one moment there, Victoria. I know that's probably a slide that a lot of folks wouldn't know about, that that the furnace was leased for this 20-year time period.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting to see this connection with Maryland. And of course, leading into your next slide. But the other thing I think about Giles, it's really interesting, is that he's a merchant, and this is kind of part of his empire that he's building. So I think it's the Bush River furnace that he has down in Maryland. He has some shares of furnaces that are in Virginia. He has this lease now in Pennsylvania. He has a wharf down on the Bush River as well, because he is a merchant, so he's able to move things in and out. So, instead of goods coming from this area, and as a Pennsylvanian, we normally would think about this, is that it would all flow towards Philadelphia. Well, in this case, everything tilts slightly further south and is using kind of the inland waterways to get out to kind of this larger, not only the colonies that we typically think about, which becomes the United States, but also then this connection with the Caribbean as well. So with other colonies. So it's kind of that's also when thinking about the enslavement of these individuals that are working here, that this is on a much larger scale and part of a much larger operation as well. So I just thought that was worth noting, and again, for people, that's probably going to be new information for most folks.
So the Giles ownership of Cornwall does open connections to the slave trade in Maryland, particularly in Harford and Anne Arundel counties. It is interesting to note that both Giles and his son Nathaniel Giles were Quakers who were generally opposed to slavery. And in the Deer Creek community that they belong to, you do actually see a fairly significant conflict regarding slavery between the 1760s and 1780s. There does seem to be disputes among the members regarding slavery. But whatever the case, the Giles didn't seem to have too many moral reservations about owning enslaved workers. During the lease, then Jacob Giles had at least 9 different enslaved individuals working at Cornwall, and Nathaniel sent at least 3 different individuals as well. Besides even the Giles' direct involvement with slavery at Cornwall, then they also seemingly got a number of their relatives and neighbors involved in leasing enslaved people to Cornwall. Often when looking through the journals, you might see initials next to an enslaved person's name. And often these initials seem to correspond to someone from the Maryland who that individual is being lent from. Generally, these leases would have been about £25 a year. And as I mentioned, then most of these people were related to the Giles in some way or other. Most notable among them is Benjamin Welsh, who is likely related to Jacob Giles through Giles' mother, who was Sarah Welsh. Benjamin leased at least Benjamin leased at least 9 different individuals to Cornwall between 1762 and 1765.
And he was one of the ones from Anne Arundel, correct?
Yes.
I believe so that's just to the south of Baltimore. So again, that idea that because it's connected by water, it's very easy to go ahead and to move goods and also then people around. So that's one of those things I know I was surprised about when you started this project, and we noticed in these books where you had, the name of an enslaved person and then these initials, and those initials started to match different people that we knew had, connections to the furnace at the time. I expected that they were all going to be very, neatly in one very small geographic area. But, even today, it would take a decent amount of time to get from where the Giles had their family, which is really just south of the Pennsylvania border, to where Welsh had his family, which was in Anne Arundel County. So again, this is one of these things that these are both people that are working as merchants and are involved in this kind of larger transatlantic economy.
Right. And among all these other names, then almost all of them have a connection again to the Giles. Philip Cole, in fact, appeared to be an apprentice at Hopewell Forge for a time. Other members like Caleb Dorsey and John Rigby appeared to marry into the Giles family, and Thomas Durbin and Henry Stump were likely also local people living in that Anne Arundel, Harford County region. I wasn't ever able to find people corresponding to the JW and WS initials. However, based on the trends here, there were very possibly also individuals living in that Maryland region. What is interesting is that this connection to Maryland appeared to withstand the Grubbs' re-ownership of Cornwall, even though probably the largest number of leases were occurring between 1762 and 1765 during the Giles' ownership of Cornwall. Even afterwards, in 1766 and 1776, the Grubbs do appear to be still leasing enslaved people from some of these Maryland individuals. And so it's interesting to see that these kind of business connections are retained through that change of ownership. So despite the number of enslaved individuals who appear to be leased or from the Giles family, then the ironmasters themselves also often owned enslaved individuals, with the Grubbs being no exception. In the 1789 inventory of Curtis Grubb, for example, which is pictured here, then there are about 22 enslaved individuals listed, working at both the Union Forge and Cornwall Iron Furnace, with quite a varied spread of age and gender. It is interesting to see that in the 1780 slave return, also for Curtis Grubb, there are only really 19 enslaved workers listed, and quite a few of these names aren't really repeated in that inventory 9 years later. So it's quite possible that Curtis Grubb was selling and buying enslaved people fairly frequently, or that records like this are imperfect and occasionally leave out individuals. Besides Curtis's ownership, then Peter Grubb Jr. also appeared to own slaves in the 1780 slave return. Then he is listed as owning 11 individuals. Obviously, that is a bit after his direct involvement in Cornwall, but it's certainly possible that while he was more involved in the furnace's operation, then he would have also been contributing enslaved workers to the furnace.
And certainly I know that was one of the things that we were looking at, is that, you know, so often the business is not owning enslaved people, but it's individuals. So the idea of having to track, you know, some of these individuals, you have to go outside of the Cornwall records, as you're already kind of showing with this, you know, with the Giles family. You really had to know who's involved in the Giles family, what members are there. So, and by looking for those, we can find these individuals. That's, you know, some research in the future, but also the same thing with the Grubb family, because it you know, family members tend to retain these enslaved individuals. So if by going through and looking at those family records, which, you know, there are various family records that exist on kind of a public scale and also a private scale. The hope is that there's some recoverable history that's there as well. And just one other thing I did want to point out about this particular slide is, if you look at the listing and it's titled Negroes at Cornwall Furnace, the first person below that is Governor Dick. So, you know, that's a local name that people know because of the geographic feature that now has that name near Mount Gretna. And I think most people, if they had before they would see this presentation, thought, well, that must have been the only enslaved person. But if you look on this list, you know, there are 21 other individuals at this particular time that are owned by Curtis Grubb at, you know, more than one of his iron operations. So it's great to be able to look at these records because they are so telling. They tell us so much information.
Right, and kind of building off what you said, then really there is no one record out there that will give you a complete list of all the enslaved people working at Cornwall at any given time. It's very much looking at different people's inventories and different records and trying to really piece together this very complicated situation of who is working at Cornwall. On a similar note, then the Colemans also owned enslaved people. Multiple branches of the family owned enslaved workers at different times. Some of these workers were likely transferred from the Grubbs when the furnace switched hands. One of the records we were able to find was an 1800 slave return for Robert Coleman, which lists 8 individuals, and which you can see to the left there. And besides the Iron Masters ownership, then there were other members in the Cornwall community that also seemingly owned enslaved workers. In particular, some of the founders, like William James and Samuel Jones, appeared to own individuals. But there are also references to general community members seemingly owning enslaved people. For example, the Old family seems to have slaves as early as 1750. And there are also various references. For example, Christian Lamb is charged one day for working with his slave, splitting stones. So other people in the community would have had enslaved people at times, some of which might have sometimes been involved in the furnace or some of the agricultural activities around the furnace.
Yes, it seems like oftentimes in these records, if there's a transaction that's happening and it's not the person who we're looking for, like the person who maybe was getting billed for the transaction, oftentimes they note who they're sending. And it seems like that's one of the places where some of these community members show up, in that they're sending Tom or they're sending some other person. And typically, you know, when was given as a first name only, or in some cases, you know, oftentimes enslaved people were given these very classical names that most other folks weren't given, that we know that's who they're referencing.
Right. And it's also interesting to note that sometimes these enslaved people are referred to by where they came from. For example, Lancaster Tom or Maryland Jack. It is interesting to see two individuals, Jam and Tom, seemingly being referred to as coming from Barbados. And again, these kinds of references do point to really the varied owners and varied places that enslaved people were coming from. Some enslaved people were likely coming straight from Africa, as seen in some of the ceremonial scars that these individuals have, but others were potentially born in the colonies, since some are mentioned as having good English. A Swedish traveler, Israel Akralis, is attributed to saying that Negroes were treated better in Pennsylvania than anywhere else in America. And while there might be a grain of truth to this statement, and conditions were never quite as bad in Pennsylvania as in the South and Caribbean, certainly then the enslaved people here were still subjected to the debilitating condition of slavery. So throughout the 1760s, then we see that housing for enslaved people is split between boarding and also a separate quarter for the enslaved workers. Henry Boyle is recorded as housing at different periods between 1 to 12 different enslaved workers, at a charge of £1 per month for each enslaved worker. And part of that condition appeared to be providing them breakfast as well. Besides that, however, we do see records of a separate house again. This house might have been a bit larger than some of the other workers' log buildings, since it did have 2 hearths as opposed to 1, as was typical in those buildings. You also see records for washing. Generally, Neil McLean or Thomas Blake is doing washing for the enslaved workers at a rate of £1 per year per enslaved worker again. There was also an overseer for the enslaved people. At different points, you see both James Coran and Joseph Walter, who were paid yearly salaries of between 35 and 38 pounds for their role of overseeing the enslaved workers. By far, though, the most common way you see enslaved individuals referenced is in their purchases of clothes. These purchases are a mix of buying clothes made by tailors and also just the cloth, which they would have potentially either sewn themselves or commissioned community members to sew. Generally, the types of cloth they're purchasing are quite typical for their position. You see a lot of linen and wool, quite often things like broadcloth or the very rough burlappy Ozenbriggs, shalloon, tammy, and cloths like that. Other times, though, you do see enslaved workers buying handkerchiefs of higher quality, more expensive cloth, like silk or cotton. And during the wintertime, you see purchases for winter clothing like mittens, blankets, and upper and under jackets. Occasionally, you do see people like Samson buying leather aprons, likely because of his role as keeper in the furnace. and more unusual things like bear skins or deer skins also being bought. There was, throughout the furnace's history, quite a discrepancy between the number of male and female slaves, with a large number of male enslaved people in comparison to female. Nonetheless, there were small family groups, certainly in both Curtis's and Curtis Grubbs and the Coleman's slave returns. You do see children being listed, but also within the journal records, you see references to, for example, Phyllis's son, Tom, and also Dina having a child. So certainly there were children being born and raised at Cornwall. Also, interestingly, there are references to a Molly Blake, who was seemingly an enslaved person at Cornwall. But the fact that she has a last name might suggest that she was in an interracial relationship.
Now, I think one of the things that's interesting about this slide and talking about living conditions is that there are some things that are unique to the enslaved population here. Obviously, you know, the overseer and of course just their condition, but just about every other worker at Cornwall also was being provided housing, was also buying you know, items in what is a company store. That's why these records show up in the records of the furnace, and living here oftentimes with families. So there's some of this is, if you look in the rest of the records, we'll see, you know, indentured servants doing some of the similar things, and we'll just see, you know, the free white population also showing up in these furnace records kind of the same way. And, you know, one of the things that kind of surprised me, Victoria, is that these records are scattered throughout, or these references to the enslaved workers are throughout the records. There's not a separate book being kept. It's just in with everything else, which is what made your job so much harder, is that, you know, not only did you have to look at, you know, decades worth of records to be able to pull out, you know, some of these things with the enslaved population. You know, there's the writing styles are different. There's all these, but it's just absolutely buried within all those records. Wouldn't you say that?
Yeah, that is absolutely true. And that's a very good point. So one thing you do see in the records that isn't quite as well accounted for other workers is some lists of various injuries and illnesses that the enslaved workers had. Some of them are quite common. You see smallpox and things like pleurisy, but also various injuries. For example, a fractured thigh, a lame foot. You see things like curing Sandy's eyes or Frank's hand. So there were clearly numerous injuries while the enslaved people were here. Even things like the runaway ad for Governor Dick mentions that he has a scar on his foot caused by an axe injury. So in general, though, the Iron Masters did seem to provide at least decent care when these injuries did happen. You do see, for example, Neil McLean and William Norman being paid for nursing some of the enslaved people at various points, sometimes during illness or potentially even during older age, considering, for example, this one talking about nursing old prints, which doesn't even explicitly mention any kind of injury. One of the things that was quite interesting to me when I was doing this project was that at times the enslaved individuals at Cornwall would have been able to earn a bit of cash that they could spend at their own discretion. This money was earned in multiple different ways. Most commonly, you see the enslaved people being paid for cutting wood over their task. But also quite frequently working on a Sunday. Seemingly, the enslaved population didn't work on a Sunday, and if they did, they would have been compensated for that. So, for example, Negro Mingo is paid about £1.02 for working 14 Sundays in 1763. Other times, you see the enslaved population agreeing to cover other furnace workers' shifts. For example, Isaac Richardson pays Nick for driving his team in between December 23 and January 1, so probably over a Christmas holiday. Other times, you see enslaved people being paid for putting in stock or weighing iron pigs. And quite frequently, they're being paid for making and selling mine or dust baskets or brooms or bowls. At no given point were they being paid extremely large amounts for all this labor, but some were quite, some individuals were fairly motivated to earn money. For example, Samson in 1763 earned at least £3, making a total of 46 mine baskets, 2 coal baskets, and 2 brooms. So if you were willing to put in the time, it was possible to earn a decent amount of money. At times, this money paid may have been to honor the wishes of the people who leased enslaved individuals to Cornwall, but it probably also served a greater purpose of attempting to motivate the enslaved workers and really meet their desire to have money they could spend at their own discretion. Numerous enslaved people sought freedom, and sometimes quite frequently and multiple times. The most famous of these is Governor Dick, who we mentioned earlier, who's famous for the hill in Mount Gretna named after him. Although he's typically you see him referred to as a collier, the runaway ad does refer to him as a rough carpenter instead. It also interestingly mentions that he previously lived in Harford County, Maryland, which again is another connection to that area of Maryland. But he was quite likely born in Africa due to the ceremonial scars that the ad mentions. Whatever the case, then his attempt at freedom does appear to be successful, since he does disappear from Cornwall records afterwards. So, however, Governor Dick was far from the only enslaved person who sought freedom. Individuals like Sam made multiple attempts. For 3 consecutive years in 1761, 1762, and 1763, Sam made attempts to leave Cornwall. And other individuals like Curtis Grubbs Jack left Cornwall twice in both April and November of 1772. Interestingly, in the second runaway ad for him, he's mentioned as now having an iron collar, which was a device sometimes used to help set aside enslaved individuals and make them easier to recapture. In general, even though there would have been some local sympathy to enslaved individuals, recapture does seem to be fairly common. For example, in 1776, Cato is captured just a few days after leaving Cornwall by Thomas Pouze, and put up for a price to be taken back to Cornwall. Allegedly, he attempted to be foolish, in their words, to obtain his freedom. In general, individuals who tried to seek freedom away from Cornwall would have fled to familiar areas. For example, Sam made for Philadelphia, where he was purchased in the past. But at other times, you see enslaved individuals making to Lancaster, where there would have been a larger African-American community, and it would have been easier for them to blend in. You also see some individuals heading to Newcastle, Delaware, and the general Maryland and Harford County Bay area, again, underlining that connection between Maryland and Pennsylvania. Also, it's not uncommon to see enslaved individuals choosing to seek freedom together. For example, you see a runaway ad for 3 individuals, Cuff, Dick, and Cross, escaping together. And the one runaway ad to the right describes both Jem and Mingo escaping together. So there is quite an extensive history of enslaved people attempting to seek freedom. Sometimes it appears to have been successful, and other times they are recaptured multiple times even. So another important thing to mention is the Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery. This act decreed that enslaved children born after 1780 would be freed after turning 28. However, gradual is the key word here, since there was some opposition to this legislation, and sometimes individuals would go through loopholes to bring enslaved individuals to another state and rebuy them. And the decrease of enslaved individuals in Pennsylvania was quite slow. There is a bit of a misconception.
I was going to say, and that's why a lot of these individuals show up in records, is because they had to register people on when they were born. Because if you were born before, you know, this magical day in 1780, slave for life. If you're born after that date, after 28 years, you would be manumitted. So it became very important to have people registered. So that's how we're able to find, you know, some of these things, because people are going and having their enslaved workers registered on when they were born. So that's how oftentimes we're able to get, you know, names with also the ages, which is one of the ways in which, when Victoria was working on the project, how we're trying to differentiate, is this the same individual or a different individual? Because are the ages roughly the same, or are they vastly different? And if they're vastly different, we could then assume that these are 2 individuals who happen just to have the same name. So sorry about that, Victoria, but I wanted to jump in and say that.
No, don't worry about it. There is generally a kind of conception, especially in Cornwall Furnace itself, that slavery really disappeared from the furnace a little bit after the 1800s, but that is certainly not true. You do see the Colemans owning enslaved individuals even in the 1830 census, and records like, again, Thomas McLean's oral history mention, for example, Isaac working in the garden in 1817, even though Isaac was born after 1780 and would have been over 28 at that age. So even with acts like this, then it took a long time for slavery to taper out, both in the greater Pennsylvania community and at Cornwall itself. So one of the things we were interested in looking into during this project was figuring out what did happen to some of the enslaved individuals, especially after they were freed, if they were free. The interesting thing is that there don't seem to be really any remaining ancestors in this region who are related to any of the enslaved individuals at Cornwall. Later African-American communities in Cornwall and Lebanon are, again, not related to the enslaved workers and generally come from the South after Reconstruction.
Yeah, I know, Victoria, that was one of the things I was just very surprised at, because when we started looking in the census records, you know, we find that kind of last enslaved person in 1830 in the census, but in 1840, we start to find very few African Americans. By 1850, even fewer still. You know, there were apparently a family that had moved into this area that was working for the Coleman family, the Mellon or the Millen family. But then when we start looking at a fairly substantial African-American population in this area in like the 1880s, when you look to see where those workers and their families were born, most of them are listing out Virginia, and they're listing out places other than here. And quite clearly, many of them, when they're born in 1858, they're born in 1859. So most likely born in Virginia at that time, they were born into enslavement. So, but those aren't apparently the same folks that were here. And that's still one of those things that I kind of find fascinating, but I'll let you talk about that because we had some ideas on why that is.
Right, it really is quite mysterious where these people ended up. One thought we have is that they moved north, particularly after the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. One specific point of evidence we have for this is we have record of a Benjamin Baker, who was born to Dina, who belonged to Robert Coleman. He, after being freed, moved up to Mosquito Valley in Lebanon County, Pennsylvania. So up north, several counties. And part of that reason might have just been after that 1850 act, it was not uncommon for slave catchers to cross into Pennsylvania and regardless of your freedom status, apprehend, I suppose, African-American individuals. And so it was really quite safer if you moved away from the Mason-Dixon line.
Yes, I know years ago I had read a book about two young girls, the Parker sisters, who had been taken out of Chester County. And the idea was that you had these people that would come out of Maryland. They would capture individuals irregardless of whether they were free or enslaved. And they would then go into the slave pens in Baltimore, and then oftentimes very quickly be sold to New Orleans. And of course, that very quickly spread, I think, amongst the free Black population in Pennsylvania. And it seems like, particularly like in southern Chester County, southern Lancaster County, where there had been large Quaker populations, there also had been these free African-American communities. And it looks like after that time, after that Fugitive Slave Act was passed in 1850, that those communities started to feel much more in danger, and rightfully so. So you start to see kind of, I think, more concentration of African Americans. You start to see going into more urban areas where there's concentrated populations, it's safer. And then also moving just away from that magical line between Pennsylvania and Maryland. And with, I think, Benjamin Baker, I think the first census that we find him, I think he's in like Schuylkill County, and then the next census he's even further north. So this is something where, you know, people are, I believe, reacting to this. And, you know, in the 18th century, this is part of Lancaster County, a county that touches Maryland. We're not that far away. So, you know, certainly if I was a family man at that time and had my druthers, you know, for the safety of my family, I'd move as well.
Absolutely. But it does make it complicated to find out just what happened to some of these individuals. Another possibility is that some enslaved people simply died at Cornwall. At times you do see references, for example, a coffin for Old Ned. There's also, according to the McLean memoir, then it was a slave graveyard. Allegedly, Dick, Cato, and Tony were buried by the barn. And there are other reports, again, of a slave graveyard somewhere on the Coleman property. However, there never really has been any indication of something like that actually being excavated.
Yes, I know that, I think also from that McLean document, that it talks about he had showed a member of the Millen family where that was located, and that today that would be located on what is the property at Cornwall Manor. There is a barn that's still standing that's there, which is now one of the buildings that's being utilized by Cornwall Manor. And there has been other oral tradition that seems to come out of other areas that also indicate a very similar location. But again, there's really nothing you know, that's been seen above ground, no excavations, you know, nothing that's ever come out. But because of, you know, these several references, you know, the coffin for Old Ned, I think that's one of the earliest years. I think that's from like the early 1750s.
Yes.
I know also from other records that we looked at that there were members of the McLean family, that Thomas McLean record that Victoria talked about. There's records in the latter part of the 19th century where those graves were relocated to the local Cornwall Methodist Church. So if they were relocated, they give the difference between a cemetery and a graveyard, you know, one of which is you know, a private piece, usually on private ground, to one that would be, you know, in consecrated ground on a church. So they're making that distinction. So there appears to be some sort of a graveyard that was on that property for, you know, individuals that they wanted to bury there. That might have been the enslaved property, and McLean himself was a gardener. So he was someone who was working very closely with the family, and thus felt that they had an obligation to put him somewhere, but eventually that was relocated. So is there a possibility that other graves could have been relocated at that time as well? It is possible, but that's not something that's in that record.
Right. Thank you, Mike. And there are multiple other ways that enslaved individuals' histories are muddied. Some individuals might have simply been sold to other iron masters or slave owners. You do see some transactions between Hopewell and Cornwall, even with them switching out enslaved workers sometimes. Other enslaved people may have successfully left Cornwall and been freed people. And then others still, especially those from the Maryland leases, likely have a history continuing beyond Cornwall in somewhere in the greater Maryland community. So to sum up some of the things we talked about, the history of slavery at Cornwall can be quite complicated. It certainly has connections to surrounding states, including Maryland, and also the greater Atlantic slave trade. There are numerous individuals who owned enslaved individuals and had them work at the furnace. And slavery was practiced at Cornwall, again, in between the early 1750s up until likely the 1830s. So these enslaved individuals would have been a quite integral part of the furnace's workforce, especially in those early years, where they're making up a large percentage of the workers. Most of them would have worked in manual labor, especially in wood cutting, but there are more skilled positions like keeper as well. And despite overpay being offered to some of these individuals, where they were able to have some cash, there were quite frequent attempts at freedom. Often the same individual multiple times. And following all that up, then there are quite limited records on what happened to enslaved workers if they were able to leave Cornwall. So there's quite a lot of further research that could be done on this subject. One possible angle of attack is looking at documents from some of those Maryland lenders to really see if, for example, after an enslaved individual leaves the Cornwall records, if you see them showing up somewhere else in relation to the Giles or some of those other lenders. There's also documents at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, more of those journals and ledgers that I didn't get a chance to look through. And it would be especially nice if we could get documents from the earliest years of the furnace, pre-1750, and also some of the later years going after the 1770s, really. There is, I'm sure, much more research to be done on this subject and plenty more information that's out there. But hopefully this presentation gave a general idea of the rather complicated history of slavery at Cornwall. So I just want to give another thank you to Mike Emery for all his help, and also to some of my very wonderful co-workers during my time here at the furnace, including Karen Fiozzi, Mike Weber, Pat Freeland, and Chi Langman. Also a quick thank you to Marcus Walco, a student at LVC, for helping me locate the Gem and Mingo runaway ad. And so if you would like to see a more complete list of all the resources I looked through while doing my research, then that is present here. And I want to thank everyone for sticking around and taking a look into history of slavery at Cornwall.
Well, thank you very much, Victoria. I enjoyed your presentation. Not the easiest thing to do without a live audience. So I thank you very much for agreeing to do this. Oftentimes when we have interns work at historic sites, there are various jobs that they do, and sometimes those don't have as much legs as we like them to, or be long-term. And this was something that I had identified for a long time as a great need. And I think you did a wonderful job learning all the necessary skills to be able to look at these primary documents and then also to be able to work with you to try to interpret them. And obviously there's a lot more, and we've only talked about the part that dealt with our enslaved population. There were tons of other things that we found out relating to the manufacturing of munitions during the French and Indian War, which is something we didn't know about. Working with other merchants and sending things down into Maryland, things we didn't see before. Also records relating to the furnace itself, different pieces that are being made. We constantly saw people coming in to fix the bellows and replace hearthstones and all those other great things in the furnace. So I do thank you very much for agreeing to do this project. And this was something that you did in less than 12 weeks. So that also made it really remarkable that you were able to go really from 0 to 60 to be able to do this and give a nice public presentation. That's the other part. So oftentimes these things are done, they're put in a folder somewhere, and hopefully someone looks at it. But by having it out there, the hope is that this will go ahead and catapult other people into looking at these records and documents. And hopefully this is the beginning of a conversation and not the end of a conversation talking about the enslaved population here at Cornwall. So again, I thank you very much. And I thank you everyone who watched this video. And I hope that we're able to bring you some more on this topic sometime in the future. So thank you.
Thank you as well. And it really was a pleasure delving into this subject.